Hey everyone, DB here from EatSleepCruise.com, the joint partnership between Royal Caribbean and Norwegian Cruise Line. The Healthy Sail Panel just submitted its recommendations to the CDC. This panel was formed in June by Royal Caribbean Group and Norwegian Cruise Line Holdings, and it's comprised of experts in medical practice and research, public health, infectious diseases, biosecurity, hospitality, and maritime operations. This group revealed a 65-page report, including 74 detailed best practices to protect the public health and safety of guests, crew, and the communities where cruise ships call. Of course, the Princess and I dove into this report to get a better understanding of all of the panel's suggestions and recommendations. And we're here to give you a detailed breakdown of all the major findings, with our complete review of all the major recommendations from the Healthy Sail Panel. For the past 4 months, the panel was tasked with closely examining every aspect of a cruise and recommending the most effective, scientifically sound ways to make the cruise experience healthier and safer. Richard Fain, chairman and CEO of Royal Caribbean Group, stated that he understood the cruise line's responsibility to act aggressively to protect the safety of guests and crew, as well as the communities where cruise ships sail. It was the goal of the panel to live up to that responsibility. Likewise, Frank Del Rio, president and CEO of Norwegian Cruise Line Holdings, announced that he believes the Healthy Sail Panel's recommendations are robust and comprehensive, which highlights the intense focus that the panel has had towards this work. The Healthy Sail Panel identified 5 areas of focus every cruise operator should address to improve health and safety for guests and crew, and reduce the risk of infection and spread of COVID-19 on cruise ships. These areas of focus include testing, screening, and exposure reduction, sanitation and ventilation, response, contingency planning and execution, destination and excursion planning, and mitigating risks for crew members. The panel recognized that risk can never be fully eliminated, but they did indicate that with the appropriate measures in place, the risk can be substantially reduced. However, many layers of risk reduction are needed, since focusing on only one area would be insufficient. The panel did highlight that the most aggressive measures to minimize or prevent COVID-19 from entering a ship is the single most important step that can be taken to reduce the risk of outbreak on board. Granted, the panel did admit that despite putting all these measures in place, an infection could still occur. If that is the case, the panel suggested that operators should minimize the risk of transmission among individuals and prevent a wide-scale outbreak. Also, provide the appropriate care on board for those infected. And finally, arrange in advance for the appropriate transfer of impacted guests or crew. So let's take a look in depth at each of these areas, focusing on the major recommendations and suggestions made by the panel. For testing, screening, and exposure reduction, the Healthy Sail Panel recommended that all crew members should be tested between 5 days and 24 hours before leaving their home location to join the ship and receive a negative result. Even with the negative result, crew members are recommended to quarantine for 7 days on board the ship upon arrival, and to take a test at the end of the 7-day period and not begin their regular duties unless they received another negative result. The panel also recommended that cruise operators should implement a crew surveillance program, which included periodic testing for COVID-19 to provide a reasonable level of assurance that the virus is not circulating among the crew. Likewise, all guests joining a ship, regardless of the method they travel to the ship, have proof of a negative result of a COVID-19 test taken between 5 days and 24 hours before boarding. At embarkation, all guests and crew boarding the ship should undergo a health screener to identify any symptoms consistent with COVID-19 or other infectious diseases, and detail any contact with individuals suspected or confirmed to have COVID-19 prior to the cruise. Similar to our experience in March of this year, the panel suggests all individuals should have their temperature taken via contactless devices as part of the boarding process. To ensure compliance, cruise operators should also not allow any individual to sail if they do not affirmatively state their willingness to comply with the current safety and public health protocols. In addition, once on board, cruise operators should conduct daily temperature checks for guests and crew. To help prevent the spread of COVID-19, cruise operators should require guests and crew to wear cloth face coverings in accordance with CDC recommendations. This includes any indoor areas where individuals could congregate during the cruise, such as theaters, lounges, as well as a promenade. The panel further stated that cruise operators should adjust guest and crew load factors in a manner that allows for appropriate physical distancing on board, taking into consideration the size and design of each ship. Operators' facilities on board the ship, at terminals, and at cruise line owned and operated destinations should be modified to promote and facilitate physical distancing in accordance with the CDC's recommendation of a distance of at least 6 feet. Finally, when it comes to reducing exposure risk, the panel suggested that cruise operators should utilize processes and protocols for touchless check-in and speedier boarding to reduce contact and potential congestion in the terminal. When it came to sanitation and ventilation, the Healthy Sail panel had several recommendations for new processes and protocols cruise lines can put in place to ensure that public areas and cabins remained clean and sanitized. Among these, the panel recommended that enhanced protocols be employed to protect against the risk of transmitting COVID-19 via inanimate surfaces or objects, with attention to both high and low touch areas of the ship, terminal, and cruise line owned and operated destinations. While cleaning, the panel recommended that operators use disinfectants for cleaning and disinfection that are on the EPA's list for disinfectants to use against COVID-19. Not surprisingly, the panel also advised that cruise operators should ensure that hand sanitizer stations, wipes, or hand washing stations be conveniently placed around the ship and be accessible to both guests and crew members. With these new protocols in place, the panel emphasized that cruise operators should ensure crew members are thoroughly trained on all aspects of infection control with an emphasis on proper hand hygiene techniques. Other upgrades were suggested, such as upgrades to the HVAC system on ships to ideally MERV 13 filters, which minimize pathogen dispersal from infected guests and crew. The panel also proposed other indoor air management strategies should be optimized, given the constraints of ship age and ventilation type. If cases are detected on ships, the Healthy Sail panel had a detailed list of recommendations for response, contingency planning, and execution. Chief among these is increasing the existing ratios of medical personnel to guests and crew on board ships. The panel also pointed out that there should be sufficient on-board medical leadership on all ships, including the designation of crew member with responsibility for infectious disease prevention and response. This individual should be in charge and oversee execution of components of the response to an outbreak. Cruise operators should also ensure that they have a doctor on board with intensive training to manage the medical care of ill patients. The panel had a host of other upgrades that should be made to medical facilities, including increasing capacity to treat patients who become critically ill from COVID-19 or other unrelated illnesses. Cruise operators were also tasked with amplifying the varieties and amount of equipment in the onboard medical facilities. Among the additions would be tests for COVID-19 infection on board. Changes should also be made so crew can accommodate care for patients presenting with suspected infectious diseases separately from care for those presenting with non-infectious diseases. For a healthy return to sailing, the panel outlined that cruise operators should have an established relationship with onshore medical institutions that can provide telemedicine consultation in the event of a more serious COVID-19 case. Other procedures include employing a variety of contact tracing methodologies to ensure that all potential COVID infections are identified as quickly as possible, as well as designating certain cabins on the ship as isolation and quarantine spaces. Further, the committee detailed that all cruise operators should have a mobilization response plan in place. Prior to sailing, to address the various scenarios that may require individuals with confirmed COVID infections and their close contacts to debark the ship. There should also be a communication plan and assign a communication lead in advance. This individual will be tasked with sharing timely, relevant information with crew and guests on board the ship in the event of a COVID infection during or after the cruise. Additionally, cruise operators should have systems in place to coordinate information about COVID infections to relevant health authorities. When it comes to planning the destinations and excursions on a cruise, the panel was very specific that there are 2 essential prerequisites that need to be satisfied in order for a ship to sail to a given port. First, ships must gain approval from the local government to visit a port. And second, and more interestingly, the port must give agreement to allow safe passage to COVID-19 infected individuals and their close contacts to debark and travel home. When determining which ports to visit, the panel suggested cruise operators evaluate 3 key parameters. First, they should consider the current burden of COVID-19 as defined by testing rate, positivity rate, and death rate. Second, they should also consider the local testing capacity of a port of call. And finally, cruise operators should consider local, regional, national implementation of COVID-19 mitigation protocols. The panel did acknowledge that cruising will most likely resume in several phases. In the startup phase, cruise itineraries should be as simple as possible, utilizing private, cruise line owned and operated destinations or ports where they can be tight control of the onshore experiences. During this phase, cruise operators should initially return to service with shorter length trips. In these early phases, cruise operators should only allow guests debarking from a ship at a destination to participate in cruise line sponsored or verified excursions as a way of limiting potential exposures in the destinations they visit. Cruise operators should establish expectations of the vendors at these destinations to ensure they are taking recommended steps to reduce the transmission of COVID. Further, cruise operators should offer indoor excursions only if physical distancing, use of masks, and other recommended protective measures can be implemented. Finally, to mitigate the risks for crew members of contracting COVID-19, the panel outlined several protective factors. First off, the panel indicated that cruise operators should manage the population density of crew areas on the ship. While the panel did propose that cruise operators should provide opportunities for crew to debark from the ship at destinations, the panel did advocate for reasonable limitations on crew movements while ashore to reduce the risk of exposure to COVID-19. When it comes to cruise quarters, the panel did emphasize that single occupancy crew cabins, whenever possible, be utilized, help minimize extended periods of close contact with other crew members. To reduce the spread, cruise operators should limit crew members' close contact with guests for extended periods of time. However, when this isn't possible, crew members should be provided with additional personal protective equipment appropriate to their job type. There should be regular crew training on protocols to reduce transmission of COVID-19, and crew should be empowered to take action to ensure these protocols are followed by guests and fellow crew members. Further, the panel highlighted the need for cruise operators to have measures and metrics in place to perform continual self-assessment of compliance, as well as third-party verification of compliance. To demonstrate that protocols can be successfully implemented on board cruise operator ships, all operators should use a phased approach before returning to full operations with guests on board. Now that we've outlined the most important points from this robust set of recommendations comprised by the Healthy Sail panel over the past several months, it's not surprising that this document confirmed many of our predictions and also gives us hope that cruising can hopefully resume soon with the appropriate health and safety measures in place. We know now that many of the same procedures that have been implemented by MSC cruises who have successfully resumed sailing in Europe will be present on Royal Caribbean and Norwegian cruise line ships once those 2 lines begin sailing from the US. In the COVID era of cruising, guests can expect testing, enhanced health screenings, and physical distancing. Guests will be required to submit a negative test result between 5 days and 24 hours before boarding the ship. If a reliable rapid test becomes widely available, the panel did indicate guests could also be subjected to a second test at the terminal. Further, daily temperature checks will be required. We also now have an official statement from cruise lines sailing from the US that facial coverings will be required in any indoor, congregate setting, regardless of physical distancing measures. Exceptions will be in guest cabins and eating and drinking in restaurants, bars, and lounges while seated. Face coverings will not be required in outdoor setting as long as physical distancing is feasible. We also now know that guest capacity will be reduced on ships, taking into consideration the size and design of each vessel. This capacity reduction also applies to all venues on the ship, including restaurants, theaters, bars and lounges, and more. Further, physical distancing will be implemented by spacing out furniture, blocking out certain seats, and moving activities outdoors whenever possible. There will also be no self-service areas, including buffets. Additionally, we have now confirmed that initial cruise itineraries will be shorter and simpler, with emphasis on cruise line-owned destinations. Guests will only be allowed to visit other destinations on cruise line-approved shore excursions. This means guests will not be allowed off the ship for self-exploration or for tours booked with external providers. This is to help ensure the safest vacation bubble as possible. The Healthy Sail panel does note that not all of these changes will be permanent. The recommendations were broken down into two categories: those that could be modified or removed over time, and those that should continue. While these plans have been submitted to the CDC as of this week, we still do not have any firm timeframe of when cruising will resume. Admittedly, it will take time for the plans to be reviewed, as well as for these measures to be carried out on the ships once approved. So, this still leaves a few questions. Is a November start date possible? If so, which ships from each respective fleet will sail first? The Princess and I are anxiously awaiting these answers. And there you have it. That's our detailed breakdown of the major recommendations from the Healthy Sail panel. But of course, we'd love to hear from you. Let us know in the comment section below whether you would take a cruise if all these health and safety measures are put in place. I'm DB from eatsleepcruise.com, and if you enjoyed this video, you know what to do. Make sure to give it a big thumbs up. If you're new to the channel, or you've been lurking around for a while and haven't done so, what are you waiting for? Make sure to subscribe to the channel and to click the notification icon. That way you get updated each week when we put out brand new cruise and travel videos. You can also say hi to us all over social media at Eat Sleep Cruise, and thanks again for watching.